which leads us into basic contract law. Now, a couple things to kind of segue into this section. First and foremost, folks, I'm going to make you say it out loud again. Are we the only industry that use contracts? No. Which means that contracts in general are not real estate specific. So if I'm asking you questions on the test about contracts in general, don't think about agency. Don't think about real estate, right? Only if we bring real estate into it do you need to think about that stuff. Here's the other word of caution as we go into this section. Remember, we've already had detailed discussion on deeds and transfer of title. And I told you that there was going to be language that was in the transfer of title section, and it's also going to be in this contract section. So you've got to make sure that you understand, is the question on the test asking you about a deed or a contract? Very different things. Okay, contracts are typically the precursor to deeds in a real estate world kind of sense, but very different things. So in this section, we're going to talk about the different elements of a valid contract, talk about what a contract is, talk about different things that a contract can be. This section has a lot of language, folks. Fair warning, this section is incredibly testable. Incredibly testable. It's not a very long section, but because there is so much vocab in it and there's so many different ways they can use it on the test, there are a lot of questions on the basic contract law questions, or on the section. Leprosy. Bubonic plague. Something. I don't know. I don't like it. So let's start with a contract, folks. A contract, you know what a contract is, but if I was to give you a definition, the crud, that's a good way of putting it. If I was to give you the definition of a contract, and notice there's some very key words in here, okay? A legally enforceable promise or set of promises between legally competent parties supported by legal consideration to do or refrain from doing a legal act that must be performed or for which the law provides a remedy if a breach of promise occurs. That's a contract. So there's some key words there, right? Enforceable, legally competent, legal consideration, legal act. And you're going to see why those words are so important in just a second. Now, folks, here's the thing that you have to understand. A contract means absolutely nothing unless you are in one exceptionally specific place. Where is that? There you go. A court of law, folks. The whole point of having a contract is the ability to enforce promises. Because, folks, do people make promises and then break them all the time in the real world? Of course they do. But having a contract allows you to potentially force them to do what they say they're going to do, or have a remedy, some type of repercussion for them if they do not perform. And so understand that as long as it meets certain criteria, we have the ability to enforce it. And if you're not going to enforce it, there's no point in having a contract in the first place. There isn't one. And I'm going to give you a couple of different ways to understand this in a second. But contracts really only mean anything in a court of law. And if you're not willing to take somebody to court over it, what's the point of having a contract, right? You might as well just have a handshake at that point. Now, let me introduce the first bit of language here. And you've already heard this before. And I told you that's kind of like the cart before the horse conundrum that we've had. I've been teaching you this stuff in a roundabout way. Contracts can be express or implied. We talked about this in the agency section. What did we say express means? Stated. There you go. So does not mean in writing. There are plenty of contracts. Folks, listen to me. There are plenty of contracts that are enforceable by word of mouth, right? Oral contracts. In some states, they're completely enforceable. Some contracts completely enforceable as oral agreements. So contracts can be express, clearly stated orally or in writing, or they can be implied. Now, we used that word earlier in the agency section as well. Implied is a contract created by our actions. Our actions showed that we were making an agreement. And I told you, North Carolina does not recognize implied agency agreements, but if I was to say, get in the car, let's go see pretty houses, that would be an implied agency agreement. We just don't recognize them in North Carolina. Let me give you another prime example of an implied contract, folks, and understand that there are plenty of implied contracts that are also enforceable. Okay, think about going out to eat at a restaurant. Folks, have you ever gone out to dinner at a restaurant and then sat down, and when you sat down, the server comes up to you and they say, "Good evening, sir and or madam, and welcome to restaurant. My name is such and such. Here is a menu. Upon looking at the menu, you will select an item that looks to be of your desired choice, and you will inform us. We will inform the kitchen. The kitchen will make your food. We will bring it out in a timely manner. You will consume it, and then you will pay for it. Here is a contract agreeing to all the terms signed here on a dotted line." Has that ever happened to you at a restaurant? No. What you're creating at a restaurant is an implied agreement. You know, when you sit your tuchus in the seat and you order your fajitas and your margaritas at a Chili's, that you're going to have to pay for them at the end of the meal. Slick. Listen, I said fajitas. Don't get excited, okay? I just put weird emphasis on the J. Y'all calm it down over there, all right? This is an implied agreement. And by the way, there are plenty of implied agreements that are enforceable. If you don't believe me, try walking out without paying. Yeah, there you go, Sergio. Go ahead, try it. All right? They're going to put you on a list. They're going to call the popo. You're going to have some issues. It is very much an enforceable agreement. So implied is our actions suggested that we understood what we're getting into. Folks, you know when you order food and drinks at a restaurant that you're going to have to pay for them. Nobody has to state that. That is an implied agreement. So contracts could be express or implied. Also, just a reminder, some of y'all are still getting on my list tonight, okay? Disappearing without putting BRB in the chat. I'm just going to start removing you because I don't know how long you've been gone. I don't have time for this. I'm trying to teach y'all, not focus on who's turning off their camera and not tell me where they're going. So express versus implied. Yeah, that's right, Bill. You tell them. Drop the elbow. Of course, through Zoom, it's not very effective. Yeah, just distracting. Folks, contracts can also be bilateral versus unilateral, okay? A bicycle has 2 tires. A unicycle has 1 tire, right? Uni means 1, bi means 2. Now, folks, please understand that we're not talking about people. We are talking about promises. So a bilateral contract has 2 parties, 2 promises. And a unilateral contract has 2 parties, 1 promise, okay? 2 parties, 1 promise. Promises, not parties. Promises, not parties. Folks, you can't have, and people always get this confused and they think parties, you can't have a 1-person contract. It doesn't make no sense. You know what that is? That's called a Weight Watchers contract, right? An accountability contract. I swear to God, I'm going to lose the weight this time, right? I'm going to sign this document, say I'm going to put down the cheesecake, I'm going to quit drinking all the booze, and I'm going to do it this time. You know the problem with a 1-person contract? When you're having a bad night, you put that thing in the shredder, you pretend it didn't exist. Ain't nobody going to enforce you to it. 1-person contracts are not a thing. So both of these have 2 parties. And so promise for a promise, okay? Bilateral, let's say a contract for the sale of a house, a standard sales contract. What are the promises there? I promise to give you money, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, and the seller promises to give them a house. Okay, promise for a promise. When we're dealing with a unilateral contract, though, there is only 1 promise. Before I get into the real estate side of things, let me help you understand this in a more simplistic fashion. If I walk out in my front yard and my neighbor's teenager is mowing their yard and I look at him and I say, "Hey, if you mow my yard, I'll give you $100. Folks, did that teenager promise to mow my yard? No. But did I promise to pay them $100 if they did? That is a unilateral contract. If you do this, I promise to do that. But the 1 person never promised to do it. And so that would be a prime example, right? If you mow my yard, I'll give you $100. Well, there is an example of this in the real estate world called an option to purchase contract. It is where you negotiate a period of time to keep a contract alive. In other words, if I go to Brad and I say, hey, Brad, listen, I really think I'd like to buy your house. And Brad and I discuss it, and he'd be willing to sell me his house for $800,000. And we agree on this. And I say, Brad, I think I want to do that, but I'm not positive yet. If I give you a couple $1,000s, would you give me 3 months to decide if I want to buy it or not? And Brad says yes. So we basically made 2 negotiations there, right? I've got this option period, the period of time to keep this contract alive that we've entered into. And of course, we've got the contract for me to buy his house if I decide to buy. But understand that if. Did I promise Brad that I was going to buy his house? No. But did he promise to sell it to me for $800,000 if I do decide to buy it?
So I got a question on that. So if you did something like that, they say, hey, I decided to sell you my house and you gave me something like that, do we ever have to put it to market, or can I just freely sell you my house without going on the MLS or?
No, yeah, we don't have to go on the MLS or anything. We worked out that deal between us. The MLS is only for marketing and things like that. If you've already got a buyer, that's a moot point. Yeah. Now, sometimes people put it in there for comparable purposes, so people know what it sold for. Other times it's completely off market, but it doesn't matter. So that is what we call an option to purchase, right? If I decide to buy, Brad has promised to sell. That makes it unilateral. Now, if I decide to buy, that's called exercising my option to purchase, right? So I call up Brad in that 3-month period and I say, Brad, I decided I'm going to buy your house. Okay, now we have upgraded to a bilateral contract. I've now promised to buy and he still promises to sell. Everybody see how that works here? So an option to purchase is going to be the most testable aspect of a unilateral contract on the national side of the test. Hands down. Option to purchase, unilateral contract. Most other contracts are going to be bilateral, right? Your, exclusive right to sell listing agreements, bilateral, bring us a buyer, we'll pay you. Open listing agreements are going to fall more into the unilateral side. If you bring me a buyer, I will pay you, right? If doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is going to work diligently to get you one. So sometimes they'll group the open listing agreements into unilateral territory. But most contracts are bilateral, right? Promise for a promise. I promise to do this, you promise to do that. But unilateral is one promise. Both still have 2 parties. So bilateral, 2-way exchange, right? 2 parties, 2 promises. I promise this, you promise that. Seller promises to sell, buyer promises to buy. Just as an example. Like I said, not every contract is real estate related, but we do tie it into it sometimes. And then unilateral, 1 promise. Okay, 2 parties, but if I do this, then you promise to do that. Okay, that emphasis on that if. Now, it does mention the option period down below, but it also mentions the due diligence period. I'm going to say hang tight on that because I don't want to fully teach it to you yet. But you will see later in the next section when I start teaching you due diligence periods in great detail that a due diligence period works almost exactly like an option period. It's just that it's a very common practice to use a due diligence period in North Carolina. So now we've got that contracts could be express or implied. We've got that contracts could be bilateral or unilateral. Next, we've got that contracts could be executed versus executory. Folks, executed, think of it like somebody being executed on death row, okay? When it's executed, it's done, all right? It's no more. And so executed means the contract is over. So fully finished, completed, discharged, donezo. If it was a listing agreement and we helped them sell our house and we got paid our commission, that is a fully executed listing agreement. It's done. If it's a sales contract, buyer got house, seller got money, that is a fully executed contract. It's done. Okay? Executed under basic contract law means done, finished, completed. Executory means under contract, but things still have to be done. So if you ever look on Zillow online and you see that a home says pending or contingent, well, the buyer's under contract to buy it, but it's not closed yet. So the appropriate term for that is an executory contract because we haven't had our day in closing yet. The deed hasn't been transferred, the money hasn't been transferred, and it hasn't been completed. So executed means completed. Executory means under contract but not completed. Now, let me kind of share with you how some of this language is going to be shown on the test, folks. I haven't introduced the word contingencies yet, but let me just kind of paint a picture for you. If I said a buyer is under contract to purchase 123 Main Street with a financing contingency, which of the following is true in regard to this type of contract? And you could have test questions like, it's a unilateral executed contract. It's a bilateral executory. It's an executory with contingencies. And you've got to be able to identify these words, even multiple simultaneously. So they're under contract, but it's not closed. That means it's executory. And the buyer has a contingency, which means it's an executory contract with contingencies. These are the styles of questions that you could potentially get. Just one of the many styles of questions you could get for the contract section. Sergio says the house next door to you is pending after 1 day. That's pretty darn good in this market because things are sitting for a while in a lot of areas because it's such a large inventory. One other piece of clarity, just to be careful, and we talked about this earlier in a different section. Be careful with the word executed using context clues. Executed can also mean signed, right? To execute something means to sign it. And so, of course, if I said something along the lines of, I sent an offer over to a listing agent and the listing agent said, here is a copy of the fully executed contract. Folks, is there any way that the house closed immediately after I sent them an offer? No. So in that context, when they're saying here's a fully executed copy of the agreement, they mean it's signed. Okay, just be very careful with context clues. To execute is to sign, so sometimes the past word is executed, but don't confuse that. Okay, under basic contract law, executed means completed, but occasionally means signed. Beverly says, so pending and contingent aren't the same thing. Good question. In North Carolina, more often than not, they very much are similar things. Contingent means, I'm going to introduce in a second, a contingency basically is a negotiation that says, if this doesn't happen, I'm not going to do that. So it's basically, think of a contingency as a get out of jail free card. So something like a financing contingency used to be like, if I can't get an interest rate better than 6%, I'm not going to buy your house. That'd be a financing contingency. So in other words, if I get quoted at a 7%, I'm not going to buy your house and I don't want to be penalized over it. Or, something along those lines. So in North Carolina, though, a lot of times if you see contingent on the MLS or on Zillow or whatever, a lot of people are just putting that as contingent because we have a due diligence period. And that is the period of time that a buyer has to evaluate the property. And so what they're really saying is it's contingent on a satisfactory due diligence period. In that instance, it's the same thing as pending. It's under contract, but the buyer hasn't gotten through their due diligence period yet. So they may back out depending on what they find is what it's more often used for in North Carolina. Not necessarily correctly. Yeah. Just for clarification, those are slightly different things, HUD and FHA. HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and FHA is the Federal Housing Administration. Technically, kind of like subsidies, different sides of things, but similar kind of level there. We'll get into that a little bit more later. So here's where we bring back the same words as we had in the deeds section. I told you got to be careful, okay? Deeds can be valid, void, voidable. Contracts can also be valid, void, voidable. And the criteria is, thankfully, identical, folks. Remember when we talked about deeds? Void has no legal standing whatsoever. Toss it out, okay? Voidable means one party could potentially get out of it. Valid means it contains all the essential elements and ergo is presumably enforceable. Now, I'm going to emphasize presumably enforceable here for a second, okay? And so I'm going to skip forward and I'm going to teach you the 4 essential elements of a valid contract, which is way easier than the essential elements of a valid deed. The deed had like 8. So the essential elements for a valid contract, I'm going to skip forward. Don't worry, I'm going to back up here. We have to have mutual agreement. Folks, if I was to look at Bridge and I said, Bridge, I'll give you, $600,000 for your house. What did I just do right then and there? What just happened? What do you call that? Yeah, there you go. I made Bridge an offer. Folks, we're not under contract because there is no such thing as a contract that is not voluntary. And so that's what that first piece is. Mutual agreement, also called meeting of the minds. It's got a lot of names. It's called agreement, mutual agreement, mutuality of consent, reality of assent, mutuality of assent. It's got a lot of stupid names. At the end of the day, it means we have to agree. No contract can exist unless all parties agree. So I made Bridge an offer. If Bridge agrees to sell me his house for $600,000, then we've got mutual agreement. Everybody cool with that? So the next piece is consideration, something of value. Money, house, cars, something of value. So in that offer that I made Bridge, I offered him $600,000. If he agrees, there's consideration. So there's essential element number 2. Contractual capacity is just like the deeds. Okay? Have to have the legal capacity to contract. What was the criteria for having the legal capacity to contract or to sign a deed? Well, ownership. Yeah, legal age is 1. There you go. 18, sane, and sober. Kind of like the criteria for this class. But for this class, I say 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Okay? 18, sane, and sober. So you have to have legal capacity to contract. And it has to be for a legal purpose, right? The agreement has to be for something legal. Folks, if we were saying, I'll trade you crystal meth for murder, that would not be a legal purpose. But house for money is absolutely legal. So I want you to understand this. As long as all 4 of these things are present, we have a valid contract. And I'm telling you, valid contracts, meaning one that contains all the essential elements, are presumably enforceable. And so let's go back to the example with Bridge. Bridge, I'll give you $600,000 for your house. Bridge, just for the sake of this, can you please agree to that? Just say yes. He says, yeah, good to go. Bridge, are you 18, sane, and sober currently? Me too, currently at the moment. Okay, some of y'all are like, no, like, listen. And I already knew, the 2 of you who shook your head, there is not a doubt in my mind. Let's just be completely honest about it, all right? I already knew. You 2 specifically were none of those things. So, and then, of course, legality. So, folks, can we agree that in this instance where Bridge and I have agreed that I'm going to buy Bridge's house and he's going to sell it to me for $600,000, that we now have a valid contract? You agree? We have all 4 essential elements. So it is a valid contract, but here's the kicker. It's still not enforceable. Why? Because it's not in writing. Why does it need to be in writing? Well, it's express already. We clearly stated the terms. It's express. Why does it need to be in writing? Think back. It doesn't need to be recorded. No? It needs to be in writing to make it enforceable. That's true. But what dictates that? Why does it need to be in writing to make it enforceable? Folks, is called the Statute of Frauds. Remember that? Certain things need to be in writing to be enforceable in a court of law, like deeds, contracts for the sale of real property, restrictive covenants, promissory notes, leases in excess of 3 years. You remember that back in the deed section? The Statute of Frauds. Contract for the sale of real property is on that list. Bridges and I's contract was for the sale of real property. Now, I want you to understand this. Folks, if I showed up at the attorney's office with $600,000 and Bridge showed up and signed the deed, could we complete this oral contract? Yes. But if neither one of us shows up, or if I don't show up on the day that I'm supposed to buy it, Bridge can't take me to court. Why? It wasn't in writing. And so understand that writing is not a requirement of all contracts. It's not, and it never will be. There are plenty of contracts that are enforceable just as an oral word-of-mouth contract. But contracts for the sale of real property have to be in writing to be enforceable in a court of law. So let me go back here. It may be valid, but still potentially unenforceable because it's an oral agreement when it was required to be in writing. Does that make sense? So valid contracts mean they're presumably enforceable, but not guaranteed to be, because if there is a statute of frauds that dictates that it needs to be in writing, it's not going to be enforceable. Now remember the most common example of voidable. Somebody who is a minor signing it would be voidable, or somebody who was under the influence temporarily would be voidable because they were not either of legal capacity to make that decision, minor, or they were not of sound mind at the time, drunk as a skunk, high as a kite. Voidable has one person has the right to get out of it if they want to. And timing matters here, of course. And then void, remember the most common example of void would be somebody who's been declared mentally incompetent. So the example I gave earlier in this class was Britney Spears. So Britney Spears, when she was in her conservatorship, did not have the legal capacity to contract or transfer ownership of a property. So if you sign a contract with Britney Spears in her conservatorship, it's a void contract. Toss it out. Has no legal standing. Is everybody still with me here? Now you've got to be able to distinguish between valid, void, and voidable. Bree says statute of frauds is state material, not national. Correct. It arguably could be both, because we're teaching you our specific statute of frauds in North Carolina, but every state has their own version of the statute of frauds. So you could potentially see it on both, but our list is specific to North Carolina. But most of them have it. So if I was to say, which of the following would not be a voidable contract? And I say there was a mistake in the agreement that meant that we didn't have meeting of the minds. A minor signed it. A drunk person signed it. Somebody who'd been declared mentally incompetent signed it. It's going to be the mentally incompetent person because that's not going to be voidable. That's going to be void. The other three are arguably voidable. And you've got to be able to differentiate these on the test. So valid, void, voidable. Now the other thing that could make a contract void is lacking an essential element. So let's give you a couple other examples here. If I said to Synthel, I'm going to give you my house for $0, right? And we even draft up a contract. It's in writing, but I'm just giving Synthel a house for free. And then on the day that I'm supposed to transfer the title to Synthel, I don't do it. And he tries to take it to court. And they're going to say, well, do you have your contract in writing? And they're going to say, yeah, absolutely. Or Synthel's going to say, yeah, absolutely, I do. And he's going to show it to the judges. And they're going to look at it, and it's going to say $0. And they're going to look at Synthel, and they're going to say, you want us to make this man give you a house for free? And Synthel's going to say, yeah. And they're going to say, get out of the courtroom. It's a void contract. It has no legal standing because it lacks consideration. So if it's lacking an essential element, it's void. As I said before too, crystal meth for murder, folks. If we put that in writing, okay, imagine that you call up, I'm going to call up some shady individual like Brooks, okay? So I call up Brooks, and I say, Brooks, hey, listen, I need you to kill somebody, and I'll give you crystal meth. Yeah, I just had to pick on you, Brooks. Of course, it had to be you, okay? There's only so many options here. So I make a deal with Brooks. Say, Brooks is going to off somebody for me, and I'm going to give him 100 pounds of crystal meth, okay? And we're just really making a deal here. And we put it in writing, and we both sign it. And imagine that Brooks goes and he kills the person for me, and he comes back and he says, Seth, where's my crystal meth? Okay, deed's been done. And I say, straight to jail. That's exactly right. And I say, oh, man, Brooks, listen, what had happened was I smoked it all. Okay, I had a wild and crazy weekend. I don't even know how I'm still alive, Brooks. I smoked all 100 pounds of crystal meth. It's a miracle I'm even still alive, right? If Brooks goes to a court to try to enforce kneecaps, more than that, right? More than that. Listen, let me give y'all some real life advice, by the way. Do not ever not pay the guy who kills people. First and foremost, don't ever hire a hitman. There's a piece of life advice number one. 2, don't do crystal meth. And 3, pay the man who kills people because he got nothing left to lose. All right. That's just some real life advice. So here's the thing. If Brooks takes the contract to a court of law and it says, Your Honor, Seth said that if I killed somebody for him, he was going to give me the crystal meth and he didn't do it. I need you to force him to do it. Folks, we don't have a contract, right? It's void. It's for an illegal act. But they're going to be like, we're happy to take you to a police officer and get your statement. And they're going to arrest him. But I want you to understand something. Yet again, just because a contract is void doesn't mean it can't be completed. Because think about it. Couldn't Brooks kill somebody for me and then I give him crystal meth and we're done? It was never enforceable in a court of law. It was a void contract, but we still fulfilled it. So it doesn't have to be valid to be fulfilled. It just is not enforceable on either party. Neither of us would be able to enforce it because it's void. Is this making sense for everybody? I saw this on Cops. Yeah, me too. So valid is a contract that presumably contains all the essential elements, okay? That contains all the essential elements and ergo is presumably enforceable. Voidable, one party would potentially have the right to back out of the contract, typically by being a minor or being under the influence at the time they sign. And then void is toss it out, has no legal standing on anybody. So I'm going to say this one more time to make sure we're all on the same page, folks. Only certain things are required to be in writing to be enforceable in a court of law. And our statute of frauds says this list, these things on this list are the ones that have to be in writing to be enforceable in a court of law. If it's not on this list, it does not have to be in writing. So let me remind you. A contract for purchasing a car is not on that list. So if you had an oral agreement to sell somebody a car, that's enforceable in a court of law, even without it being in writing, because it wasn't required to be in writing. If you had a lease for less than 3 years, it could just be an oral agreement and still be enforceable in a court of law because it wasn't required to be in writing. It would still be stupid to not have these things in writing, but it's not legally required to enforce it in court for it to be in writing. So do not think that oral agreements are not enforceable. Do not think that implied agreements are not enforceable. There are plenty of them that are. But of course, in the real estate world, there are certain contracts that are only enforceable if they are in writing because of our statute of frauds. So let me ask you a question here. You read it and then we'll go over it. And tell me what you think. So the answer is false. So we're going to go over it. But folks, what part specifically is making this false? There you go. Paige got it. Folks, true or false, Barbara is so excited to be purchasing her condo at Kerr Beach, North Carolina, that she stops off at the Sea Witch Cafe for a couple of Long Island iced teas prior to signing the offer. OTP and C is the offer to purchase in contract. Hopefully y'all piece that together. This would automatically void the contract. No, it is not void. Being under the influence is voidable. She could potentially back out of it, but it is still enforceable on the seller, because they were presumably not under the influence. Okay, voidable. I told you, you would bear the burden of proving that you were under the influence in order to back out of the contract. And the reason we call it voidable and we don't automatically void it is because she's probably completely fine to make these decisions even after a Long Island iced tea or two. Even though they're strong, she probably knew what she was doing. But sometimes people are not making good, smart decisions when they're drinking. And because of that, it is potentially voidable. But do you see the nuance there? If you told me that this was void on the test, you got it wrong. It's voidable, right? You've got to know the difference between voidable and void. Everybody with me? Void contract has no legal standing on either party in court at all. Never enforceable in any way, shape, or form. Buyer, seller, doesn't matter. So somebody being declared mentally incompetent prior to signing, folks, timing matters. So if I said that, a seller signed a contract, but it was later discovered that they had been declared mentally incompetent 3 weeks before signing, what is the status of the contract? You would tell me what? Yeah, void. Because you discovered after they signed that they were declared mentally incompetent long before they signed. Timing matters. They were already mentally incompetent. Just because you didn't know doesn't change anything. It's void. If I was to say a seller signed a contract and 3 weeks after got in a terrible accident that left them with brain damage and they were no longer able to make sound decisions, what's the status of the contract? Yeah, Bill, valid. They were of sound mind at the time that they signed it. Timing matters in this, okay? Timing matters. If they were of sound mind when they signed it and then got drunk, that doesn't change anything. If they were of sound mind when they signed it and then became mentally incompetent, it doesn't change anything. It's still a valid agreement. Timing matters. So same thing too. If a minor signs a contract 3 weeks before he turns 18 and then turns 18 and then waits for, another 3 months before trying to back out of it, they may not have as much ability to get out of it. The longer they're an adult without trying to rescind it, the less likely the courts are to side with them. If they do it the day they turn 18, they're probably going to be able to get out of it. If they, wait 3 months, 6 months, timing matters with these things. So you got to be very careful with all the details that it gives you on these questions. So somebody under the influence, right? Drunk as a skunk, high as a kite, voidable. If they were drunk as a skunk, high as a kite at the time they signed it. And this is why I told you in the earlier section when we were having this conversation, real estate closings used to be held at bars, but they wouldn't let anybody drink anything until all the documents were signed for this obvious reason, because having any alcohol could potentially make a contract voidable. Let me make sure you're with me here. Minor who is almost 18 years old signs a contract to sell real estate. This would render the contract what? There you go. Voidable. Okay. Minor or somebody drunk as a skunk, high as a kite would be voidable. Of course, this would be at the seller's request because the seller is the minor. It would not be the buyer. The buyer, if they're over 18, doesn't have the right to void the contract or invalidate it. But the seller, the minor, would. They would have to go to court. They would have to, rescind it and kind of go back on it. It's that whole piece of the voidable aspect. Now, we did talk about consideration. Okay, something of value doesn't have to be money, but something of value. Folks, in that earlier example, I think I said with Synthel that I tried to give him a house for $0 and it wouldn't be enforceable because it lacks consideration. If we had just put $1 on the contract, it would have been able to go to court. He probably still would have lost because it was gratuitously low consideration, but it would go to court because there was at least some consideration on the contract, right? It has to have something of value. If it lacks it, then it's lacking an essential element. Now, I'll put this slide up, and this is where I'll just let you chit-chat with me for the last few minutes. And like I said, we're rocking and rolling through the contract section. It's not a crazy amount of information, but there's so many different ways they can spin the information to different questions, and they do. So we will finish the contract section tomorrow and get into the vast majority of the North Carolina sales contract section tomorrow. Probably won't finish it, but and then things really start boogieing along.